And, before we, kick into it, just really want to make sure that people are getting the most out of this. And so really making sure that, you're challenging yourself in these contexts. Conversations are really hard to do, and they can be challenging at times. And so really, center yourself in that as you move forward and really push yourself out of your comfort zone to be having those conversations. We will have a bunch of interactive components. And so there will be polls that will pop up, and you can be answering questions in those polls, and we'll be answering we'll be, going through them. And there are a bunch of other features that you can see in the more. So you'll see the 3 dots and then the more. If you click there, there is also a chat and a Q&A for people. So yeah, and for accessibility purposes, closed captioning is available. And the training will also be recorded for YouTube. So I think, before we kind of kick off all of this, just want to do some group agreements. And so this is really about how we want to treat each other in this space. We want to make sure that this is a really respectful and safe space for people to be getting the most out of it. And, noticing your own actions in this and what you might be saying, particularly in the chat, taking responsibility, for your actions and behaviors and how those behaviors and actions and words impact other people that might be different to what you've intended them to be. Be aware of your participation and your privilege in this space and how, you are showing up. Be open-minded, and also just a note, discriminatory behavior and language, no racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia will be tolerated. And if that does occur, we'll actually be removing people from the space. We also just have a couple of points of contact. So we have Darren, who is our tech host for any tech concerns or questions. And so if you do have any tech related questions, please ask it in the Q&A down the bottom, and at the start of your message, if you just write tech and then your question or your concern, and Darren will answer that. And, relating to that point around how you are in this space and discriminatory behaviour, if you do have something you want to flag that has happened in this space, we have Amy Morgan on the call, who is our Community Safety and Wellbeing Officer. And so if you do have a safety or security concern during this call, please message one of our panelists or co-hosts, so myself, Riss, Charlie or Kaz in the chat, and we will make sure we will flag it with Amy, and Amy will get in touch with you to help you with your concern. And so I think we have come to our first interactive question. And that question is quite a simple question. Where are you calling in from? If you know the country that you're calling in from, please put it in the poll that I believe is available. It's being popped up for you to do. Great. That's it from me. You'll hear from me a bunch throughout this, but I will now pass it on to Kaz. Thank you. Right. Oh, there's the poll.
So great. It would just be awesome to see who's who in the room and like where you all are calling from. So please, folks, yes, we'll give folks a few minutes to quickly add in their answers to where they're calling from. And then our tech will close the poll so we can see results shortly. Great. And I'm seeing as well that, yeah, some folks are saying that it's great that this is also being streamed in YouTube too. All right. Maybe let's close polls and then we can see how folks are tracking. What are the results? Wow. Okay. So New South Wales is winning at the moment. There's more folks from New South Wales closely followed by folks from Victoria as well. And great that we have some folks here as well from WA and the NT2. So welcome. Thank you all. And then the next bit, we'll just do a little getting to know you activity. We'll do another round of polling. And the question that we're asking folks are, if you'd like to share like what you're hoping to get out of the training today, so that hopefully we can hit those goals or objectives, and also think about, in terms of this campaign, who or what gives you strength and inspiration as we ramp up the campaign. Yeah. If we can see that polling question as well, question 2. Thank you. So again, how polls are answered, they pop up on your screen as participants, and you are able to directly input your answers there. All right. We'll give folks a couple of minutes to answer, and then we'll pick out some great responses from people. All right, let's see if there are other questions here. All right, there's actually some folks saying that they'd like to be able to express their support as well. Awesome. Yes, if we can maybe close the poll now and view the answers of folks. Yep. So most people have answered the first question we can see here, but I'm wondering, are there responses that maybe that we can uplift? So folks want to have skills to make a difference this referendum with persuasive conversations. Folks are already volunteering as well with other groups. They want to make sure that they have effective messaging to strangers and groups as well, and a way to be able to talk with people who might disagree or are still undecided, and that they want to have the confidence to have difficult conversations and be able to speak positively about yes, and to have better knowledge of the benefits of this to First Nations, and a way to better understand the referendum as well, and how to learn best practices of moving people from not sure or undecided to voting yes as well. And I think there are some great answers here as well regarding the strength or inspiration that folks draw from as we ramp up the Right Yes campaign. And folks mentioned that it's the hard work that First Nations women are putting into this issue or cause. Reading, so reading the useful resources that's coming off the back of passing the message stick as well. And their strong belief in the power of change and justice as well, and like the variety and diversity of people who are stepping up to shift people into writing yes as well. All right. Thanks for answering those questions, folks. I think sometimes it's just good for us to get to know each other a little bit better first before we dive into the content. I like what I like to say is like connect first before content, like every time. And so I'm not sure if it was mentioned already, but I know that Amy did a brief introduction for me. But so I'm Kaz, she, her. I'm currently the organizing director of Get Up as well. I'm calling you from Noongar country. Hopefully, I'm not butchering that. And after this relational activity, our CEO, Larissa, will be giving us a quick right yes briefing of what our vision and our goals are and what this moment means, because I know that there's some people who wanted questions about like what does this referendum actually mean, and what does having a yes outcome or no outcome mean for Australia. So I'll hand over to you, Riz.
Unmute. Doing well, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Can you hear? Yeah, great. The last time I did a referendum call, it was a bit of a disaster. So hopefully this is good today. But thanks everyone for coming. We are just weeks away from the referendum. So yeah, I'm Get Up CEO, but I've also been leading a lot of messaging research projects for many years, looking at how we win progressive change for First Nations people. And so all of the work that we do today is based in messages that are tested. And I think one of the things that is really unique about passing the message stick in the work that we do is that this research starts from our community. So we go out and look at the advocacy around the issues that our mob are campaigning for, and we look at what works for our mob in terms of what they're saying that is really true to kind of the language that they use and the way that they feel comfortable speaking in our first voice. And so within that, we then look at, of those messages that are really powerful within our own communities, what of that really resonates within the persuadable audiences of Australia. So we don't look at things in terms of like left and right, we look at them in terms of like base, persuadable and opposition. And I'm sure that Amy or Kaz will take you through that later. We're going to talk about the moment that we're in right now. And talk about the kind of the role we have to play thinking about First Nations justice. But this moment is critical. We see this as kind of a launch pad to be able to win a lot of change. And for me, I think about Auntie Joyce Clegg, who's the Yagle elder, and some of you may know her as an incredible civil rights activist, was very one of the instigators to start the 67 referendum. She's in her 90s now, but yeah, she's up on Yagle country, and she said this thing that had we known that we'd win the 67 referendum by so much, we would have asked for so much more. They just had no conceivable thought that there could be that groundswell of support and what they could have achieved in the decade after it, had they had really built momentum around the real substantive changes that needed to happen during that. But she is has been an incredible lifelong campaigner, and you know, the engine room behind even Yagle mob getting their native title and that sort of stuff is one of the longest running claims in the country. So in this moment, we're talking about if we win, if millions of people vote yes, if millions of people write yes on referendum, then that will be kind of the political will shifting in this country, telling state, territory and federal governments that we need to shift from the status quo. And so we really believe as the Get Up movement that what is at stake is basically a lot of things that we've had on the table, a lot of things our communities have been fighting for generations. But also we know that if we lose, that it will have a devastating impact on the political psyche in this country. We know the impact of the intervention and what that did to the, you know, trajectory forward within our communities. And we absolutely, if you look at the Closing the Gap reports and those types of things, every metric we've basically gone backwards when we kind of lost that big momentum. And I would say the majority of support across this country as well. But it's not just on First Nations justice issues. I know the 2019 election had a huge issue on climate action in this country, and we see it over and over and over again. So we understand there's a lot at stake. The polling looks really scary, but we know that if we can win the narrative and win the conversation, so make everyday people feel like this is an easy conversation to have, feel comfortable in moving within your own values, and using that to persuade other people, because we know that's what works and that's what cuts through, that actually can cut through, you know, all the kind of Murdoch-dominated media, all the money behind the No campaign. We know that we're never going to have more money than their forces against us, and that we can actually persuade people that this is really an important moment we're never going to have this opportunity again if we don't win this moment. And so we need to make sure that we make the most of this and set it up for the type of change that we're working to. So part of the thing is within the broader campaign that people are really struggling with is that people have this idea of a constitutional change not making sense in terms of like a tangible outcome for people. And so what we've been training people to do around the country is to probably use our theory of change. So why do we believe as a Get Up movement that this is going to build the type of change, or the type of change that we want to see? So our theory of change is that if we build a groundswell of public support and win a resounding yes, then a wave of transformative change for First Nations justice will follow. Because public momentum and demand gives governments a political mandate to act on bold policy reform. So we tested this message right across the country within Aboriginal communities where people didn't support it, didn't know anything about it, did support it. And this was something where, particularly within our communities and First Nations people, had more faith in the political power of voters working in solidarity.
But
can you hear us? Oop, can I switch? They had more faith in the Australian voters than they actually do within the governments and the decisions and the promises that they're making, because that's how political power works in this country. To the next slide. So what does our vision for transformative justice look like? So it is really important when you're talking to people. I know I just talked about closing the gap, and some people are aware of what that thing means, and some people are aware of different ideas around self-determination or transformative change. But what is best is that when we talk about the things that we aspire to, or what that vision is, that we actually spell it out and get down to actually talking out what those things actually mean to us. So we're talking about treaties and truth-telling and decision-making and veto rights. We believe that you can do them all, that we have, it's going to take a long time to get these things done in terms of actually the work and reform and the consultations, but this is the journey that we want to be on, and we can achieve these things. We're talking about First Nations-led justice. Our communities have the solutions, absolutely, into the issues that we're dealing with in our communities. We're talking about fully resourcing our Aboriginal controlled organisation, and we want to see change that actually realises the aspirations of our communities that we've been fighting for so long. So much of the conversation that's out there right now within our communities who hadn't heard much about the referendum is that they're worried about that all of a sudden there's this other issue that's on the table, and maybe all of a sudden the issues maybe around healthcare or deaths in custody, those things are being put to the side. No, we're talking about actually creating change that builds momentum for all of those things. So we want change that will make a real difference to everyday lives, and something that's enduring and guarantees a better future for generations to come. What we're doing right now is we are gearing up for a referendum. I have never had the opportunity to vote in a referendum, but I'm sure a lot of you on this call have. But a referendum is different to an election. The way that the average voter is perceiving this vote is that it is a vote on First Nations people. So people will vote their intentions on how they perceive us, our identity, and that is a scary thought when you're thinking about First Nations people making up 3% of the population, but also in terms of like the state of the kind of political discourse and debate around this referendum has been pretty harmful for our communities. And you know, that's without thinking about actually what the day after referendum day will look like. But absolutely, the gloves are off in the way that people are thinking that it is okay to talk about our communities, or talking about the idea that there is, you know, division as dysfunction and all those types of things. But we'll talk more through that. So the idea is that we need to sell an idea, and that's really hard because we're trying to sell, you know, there's this idea around talking about the constitutional recognition. The problem with that is that we're not visible within that frame. We'll talk about more about that later. But we need to focus on First Nations people, and most importantly, we need to focus on our aspirations and our strengths and our capability, because that's the kind of equation that allows people to see that actually giving us more control over our own destinies will change the course of where we are right now. So this is not a contest of ideas. It's not like an election. It's very different in the way that we need to have the conversations. And within the referendum, what is really hard is that we are now in kind of a social media age where you are kind of dictated to within your algorithm. So if you are perceptive to the no messaging, that's all you're going to see within your feed. If you're already on board and supportive, then all you're going to see is all of your friends being supportive. And you may think, we've done it many times before in campaigns, that everyone is agreeing with us. But the reality is, if you're susceptible to misinformation and disinformation, then that's all you're going to be seeing within your feed. So it is real conversations that actually cut through that with people who, you know, not politicians, not the kind of talking heads that are on media. People have a big mistrust of those spaces. And so it is real people out there getting it and having a conversation and being willing to engage with people that does cut through. So we are in a race against time. We'll talk a little bit more later about kind of the methodology around how persuasion works, but we know this messaging works. What we don't know is how long it will take people to make up their minds. We know it's already happening. There is some messaging research to say that, you know, people need to see kind of an affirmative message like 6 to 8 times before they're persuaded by it. And right now, if you look out there in the media, you would see absolutely that the No campaign is really cutting through. And I think really getting an outside influence in media and that sort of stuff. So we need to mobilise now. We know it's only weeks away. That's our best intel, that we're going in mid-October to a referendum. So we need to get going now. We're not going to wait for Albanese to kind of call the referendum to get going. Every day counts. All the conversations that you can have, the more messages we can get out there. People are more likely to repeat instead of leaning on what is the frameworks and reports and that sort of stuff and messaging around constitutional recognition. They're more likely to rely on a conversation that resonated with them. If it was just like someone that they've seen at the shops or someone that they know or a family friend or someone like that, and repeat those frames. So kind of using your personal narrative, using your values as a way to kind of bridge that gap. That's when we can kind of move across that divide and actually reach people and persuade people. So we want to explain to people how kind of First Nations people winning this, First Nations people leading in the messaging and those types of stuff will help us win a resounding yes, which will open the door to long-term change that we all want to see. Because we do know that there's something like 55% of the population actually believe that this moment is bigger than just the referendum. We know that non-Indigenous people want to see a national unity moment, and they want to have that and kind of move towards that journey. And First Nations people want to see self-determination. And so when you have politicians and different people out there saying, you know, this is nothing, it's kind of toothless, all those types of things, it actually kind of dissuades people from getting involved because they think, oh, this isn't really good enough, right? I don't feel excited about this thing. So genuinely, if you want to get people active, you need to make them feel inspired about where we're going and feel hopeful about where we're going. So I think this is my last note, but this is just a note on respectful dialogue. So within the debate, like attacking or undermine First Nations voices, it kind of feeds this dysfunction narrative that is really popularised under Howard and within the intervention and that sort of stuff. It polarises our communities in terms of First Nations communities into really defensive positions and not wanting to move into the conversation around it. So we don't want to be attacking people that are opposed to us. But also the other thing is right now in the way that kind of the political debate is polarised, even regular people, if you're not engaging in a respectful way that kind of asks them what they know and kind of, you know, you may not be able to persuade them in the conversation that you have, but if they have a respectful communication with you, they're more likely to be open to having another respectful conversation with somebody else. And it's many of those kind of on top of each other that actually shift people. And so we want to make space for respectful dialogue so everyone can be informed about making the right decisions for them and their community. But also, you know, as First Nations campaigners, this is a really tricky thing for us to go out there and work within our communities on as well. It is really, we're not going out there to sell to our communities that, you know, you should just trust the Labor government this time, because the reality is governments, we wouldn't be here at a referendum on a voice to Parliament if governments had got things right. So our communities don't trust that governments have our best interest because that is our lived experience overwhelmingly. And so you're not going to be able to change First Nations people's minds who are a no, who just do not trust government. That is a big kind of driving force behind people being unsure. And so engage in a respectful conversation and maybe ask more about them and their perspectives as well. So we want to make space for respectful dialogue within this as well. So our story is really about moving forward together. So the idea that we know what's best and what works best, and the government needs to listen and act. The changes we need to show, we need to talk about the changes that we need as the kind of the next step, and that are kind of a no vote, understanding within progressive voters, this is probably something important to explain, but progressive voters and the progressive base of activists are really not mobilised into this campaign for a bunch of different reasons, and we need to make sure more people who are usually out there with us on election day understand that we need them out there. And so one of the ways that we can talk about why they should get mobilised into this campaign is also to talk about what's at stake here in the way that we see that. So we're going to be using the opponent's story, talking about this being special treatment, or the idea that this is a special handout. That is always going to be the myth that is being told about First Nations people. It's not true, but it doesn't matter. It's very persuasive. So don't bother trying to myth bust. Just stay within our own stories. Don't respond to the opponent's story. It only makes it stronger.
I think that's it. Yeah. That's
Yeah, sorry. It's like, this is your
no.
Sorry.
Hold on. You go if you want to wrap up.
No, you go. I will. Sorry.
I think we've got like some questions. Is that right, Kaz? Do you want to pull out some of the questions that we're getting for Riss?
So there was a question earlier about like, how do we know that that idea of raising the ambition is actually effective in shifting undecided folks?
We've seen it in our message testing, and we've done the messaging research on this, but we have also gone out there and we've trialed this messaging really significantly across the country now. We see a shift in 10% of persuadable's opinions on the referendum into moving them into a yes vote. And if we were to use, say the persuadable audience is 65% of the population, really, on any kind of issue, the voting population, I'd say, that would be enough to win the referendum. So the thing to understand is we talk about when kind of like how things become popularized and that sort of stuff. It isn't that everybody suddenly is an expert on First Nations justice or any justice issue. Like, you know, I think people that are part of our movement feel like they may campaign on lots of different issues in climate, refugees, First Nations justice, and feel like all of these things make society a better place. But really the middle of Australia voters who tend to vote Conservatives, really, you know, the gulf between us, people who are really politically active all the time and people who just are switched on when they need to switch on to it, there's a big difference there. And so what we've seen over the last decade is that, and that's what makes this moment special, is that there is kind of a popularization around First Nations justice. People may not understand the issues completely or be an expert on them, but they do believe that something needs to change. And so what we need to, in terms of the ambition message, is that the constitutional recognition argument is really hard to cut through with that audience because they don't understand how changing a 100-year-old document is going to change people's lives. But if you can break it down into the tangible aspects around why a representative body will be able to give better advice, not just for First Nations people, but representative bodies with people with disabilities, people who live in regional areas, people who are affected by issues are better at making policies. If you can break it down like that, then we know those persuadable audiences move with us. But also the other thing is like things like treaty. I know there is a big attack campaign on treaty right now, but the reality is treaty is even more unpopular than this kind of constitutional reform that we're talking about in these mechanisms. So people believe that, may not understand exactly what it is, but they do believe it is substantive change, and they do think that there's something substantive needs to change from the status quo.
And another question here for you is, there's a question about like, so we're not responding to myths or lies of the no campaign. Should we do myth busting?
We shouldn't do myth busting because all we're doing is basically repeating the opponent's frame. And you have to understand that what was popularised during the Howard era, the idea of special handouts, the idea of wastage of money into Indigenous affairs, these are really big persuasive narratives against us, and it's best to not even go near them because we know the persuadable audience can believe the same thing. Like the persuadable audience we tested in earlier messaging research rounds, they can believe that Aboriginal people get special handouts and special rights, and there is a lot of dysfunction within our communities, but they can also believe that Aboriginal people have been, have historically had terrible things done to them, and that governments are not making the right decisions, and that there needs to be change. The thing that they end up making a decision on is the thing that they hear the most. So that's why we say don't repeat the opponent's frame, because they're already hearing so much of it right now. And honestly, the polling is so tight that we just want to focus on persuading them on the messages we know that work. So don't step into repeating their frames.
All right. I think this is a good segue, Amy, to talk about messaging since that question is a prominent question that folks are asking as well.
Yeah, great. So I think for the next little while, we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about like why messaging matters, and digging into a little bit about the Passing the Message Stick research that we've done, and looking at, you know, some of the key messaging recommendations and some of the key frames that we have tested. And I think before we kind of dig into that, to just give you a bit of an overview, basically, you know, Passing the Message Stick is a project that is being run by Get Up, Australian Progress, and Auntie Jackie Huggins. And so this is a multi-year project that basically looks at how we win transformative change on First Nations justice by looking at the messaging that we use, who is the best messenger, and what resonates with the community, with First Nations people, with the rest of the community as well. And obviously, when we realized we were going into a referendum year, we decided that we needed to have a research project that really looked at messaging in the context of a referendum and representation. And so we have spent many months having many conversations, doing dial testing, doing focus groups, and really testing this message to make sure that it not only works for First Nations people, but it works across the spectrum of base and persuadables. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And so, you know, the reason, you know, we have done this is because we know that messaging matters in campaigns. Messaging moves campaigns, and whether it's conversations, whether it's social media, whether it's through media, it's really important to get our messaging right. And what we say is that, you know, when we get the right message delivered by the right messages to the right audience at the right time, we actually win campaigns. And over time, we also generate, you know, attitude shifts in the work. You know, we know that on First Nations justice, this isn't a year-long campaign. This has been going on for decades, and it will continue for decades to come. And we actually need to start moving the needle on the attitudes of the population on First Nations justice. Because what that means is that when the next campaign comes along, that campaign will actually be easier to win. And by doing this, we're actually building long-term change. And so, next slide. This research is really based on a messaging expert, Anat Shenker-Osorio, who does a lot of work out of the United States. She's also done a lot of work with the refugee sector here, who basically looks at messaging that is being used by the progressive movement, what's working, what's not, and how we need to change and reframe our messages. And so Anat says that a good message doesn't say what's popular, it makes popular what needs to be said. And so, you know, we really look at not just what we need to say for this particular moment, but what we need to say for the next decade. And that really is grounded in this research, but also goes back to what Russ was saying of how we need to be talking about transformative change. Next slide. And so this is just a little bit of an idea of how we've actually broken up our audience segmentation. And so you'll see here that there are 4 audiences, and I'll speak about the First Nations audience in a little bit. But really, you know, when we look at messaging, this is who we are looking at what is going to work for these audiences. So we have the base, which is all of you guys on this call. This is about 20% of the population. These are the people that, you know, turn up to rallies, are organising, are having conversations in their communities. And, you know, they're a really crucial part of this puzzle because we need to activate the base in order to move the persuadables. And so the persuadables are about 65% of the population. And, you know, we actually call these people the good point people. And so they will hear a message from Peter Dutton that is really outrageous, really racist, and they'll say, oh, that was a good point. And then they'll hear from, you know, a First Nations person talking about strength, talking about capability, and they'll say, oh, actually, yeah, that's a good point too. And so actually, whoever they are hearing from the most is actually who they tend to agree with. And so most of these people are with us. But right now, you know, what we know is that they're actually hearing from the No campaign more. They're hearing the daily news cycle. They're hearing it on social media. They're hearing it on their, you know, seeing it on their ads. They're seeing it, you know, talking to people in the community out there. They're actually hearing from the No campaign more. And so what our job is over the next 8 weeks of this campaign is to ramp up that work that we need to do in the community, to really socialize this so that people are actually hearing from the yes and from you know, people on this call more than they're hearing from no. And that's actually how we move people. And, you know, like Chris said, actually people need to be hearing a message, you know, 8 times before it actually sinks in. And so what we have to do over the next little while is cover the community in our messages of strength. Flyers, you know, on polls, letterboxing, door knocking, phone calls, conversations at local markets on a Saturday morning, you know, conversations at barbecues, all of those things are really important to moving this particular group of people, the persuadables. And then finally, the opponents, before I talk about First Nations, opponents who are about 15% of the population, you know, they are completely against this. We are never going to move them. They are, you know, your Andrew Bolts, your Peter Duttons. So actually what we need to do is find messages that alienate our opponents. And so that means we need to be talking in values-based messaging. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a little bit. But, you know, this is about 15% of the population. And so right now, 8 weeks out, we really need to concentrate on our base and the persuadables. And then finally, First Nations audiences. And so this is the most important audience when we're talking about First Nations justice. You know, we're about 3% of the population, and normally in any given issue, whether we're talking about deaths in custody, cultural heritage, you know, stopping fracking in the Beetaloo, mob are usually in our base. You know, we're the ones organising the rallies, turning people up, doing the work, the spokes, all of that. But right now in this referendum, you know, First Nations people are largely persuadable. And what we have found in our messaging research is that the messages that we are talking about and grounding it in this actually is really helpful in overcoming some of the issues that people in First Nations communities feel about this referendum. And I think on that, you know, I think there's a few things to say. One, you would never expect another population to totally agree on a particular issue. And I think there is a spectrum of views within First Nations communities about this moment, and that is totally okay. You know, we have a lot of mistrust around government, like Ruth said. You know, there's a lot of people who are calling for a lot more in this and are trying to raise ambition on this, are calling for treaties, are calling for truth telling. And we are also doing like that piece of work. And we know that we need we need to win a resounding yes to get that. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is about making sure that First Nations communities feel comfortable in the messages that we're using, because we know, A, we're the most important audience in this particular moment, but B, we're also the most important messengers. From our research, we know that the rest of the population actually feel quite uncomfortable about voting on an issue that doesn't impact them. And so they need to be hearing from First Nations voices to make up their minds about how they're going to vote. And so that's a big part of the work that we're doing. Great. And so through our work, we have 5 messaging recommendations, and I'm just going to talk us through a little bit of what that means. So number 1, our messaging recommendation is shared values. We know when we go out there and talk about facts and figures, you know, people glaze over, they don't, you know, they can't connect with that. But if we're bringing this back to shared values, we can really connect with people. So for example, you know, our team works a lot with traditional owners in the Beetaloo around stopping fracking. And, you know, instead of going out there and talking about the chemicals in fracking and what it means and all of that, one of the biggest messages we use and one of the biggest things we talk about is that everyone deserves access to clean water. And I think everyone can agree that we need water to survive. Everyone can agree that everyone should have access to clean, safe water. And that's how we actually connect with people on that particular issue. Now, in this referendum, and in this research that we've done, we found that listening, respect, and equity is a really strong value and frame. And it's something that we should be using quite more of. And so talking about how, listening to First Nations people, have a say about the things that impact them, respecting what they're saying, and then acting on that. And replacing it with messages around, more bureaucracy and separate race-based a race-based body. And we actually found that actually using values and connecting with values actually helps build alignments across those audiences that I spoke about before, of the base, persuadables, and First Nations. Number 2 is a clear vision. And so actually, I think there was a couple of questions in the chat about this. Actually, when we went out there and tested this, 56% of people actually thought that this moment was bigger than the referendum, that this was about the next decade of First Nations justice. And actually support for the referendum jumped 10% when we actually can ask them to connect to the solutions and the bigger vision of what this could mean. And so that's a really huge shift. And when you look at the polls right now, where, losing about 1 to 2 points a month, actually that 10% jump is really, really critical in this particular moment. And so vision is about, where we're going, why we're going there, and what actually needs to happen, and what will happen through the referendum, and how we move through that. And so that's really, really a really huge piece of this puzzle. The next recommendation is a credible and compelling theory of change. And so this is about where we are now and where we need to be. And so a theory of change is basically we shared ours at the start about building a groundswell of support for First Nations justice. And so a theory of change is about telling a credible story of why we need to do this thing right now to get to where we need to be. And so it needs to be credible, that this particular moment, the referendum and the voice, will actually be credible for people to support, and it needs to be compelling in order for people to act. And so our research shows that people really resonate with the line around this particular moment is a step in the right direction to where we need to be. It's not the first step by any means. There's been decades worth of work. It's not the last step, because there's a lot of work to still come out of this, but it's a really credible step in the right direction. First Nations strength and leadership, number 4. Oh no, sorry, back. First Nations strength and leadership. And so obviously right now, talking about First Nations people in a way that is strength-based, that is not deficit, is really important. Using examples of how, First Nations communities are the ones who have started, our Aboriginal controlled health organisations, our legal services. The one that I always use is, at the start of COVID, before the federal government was acting, it was First Nations communities who were calling for lockdowns, were calling for PPE, were calling for masks to be sent to communities because they understood the risk, and that they also had a clear plan for what should happen. And remote communities were doing that before the federal government. And I think examples like that are really tangible, that show strength and leadership, are really important in this moment, because, our research shows attitudes towards First Nations people will really strongly influence voting intention. And so, persuadables are more likely to shift support in favour of this if they hear stories of strength and leadership. Because if they're hearing stories of, poverty and, deficit, hearing those stories and then hearing, well, First Nations people should have a say over the issues that impact them, those two things don't measure up. And so they need to be hearing stories of strength and leadership, and then that First Nations people should have a say over the issues that impact them. Those two things really align. And so we need to be talking about stories of strength and leadership. Because really, I think at the end of the day, ultimately, this vote is about us and is about, how people perceive First Nations communities. And then finally, a clear sequence. And so we were doing this research in January, February, in summer, when the No campaign really got out of the gate. And we were doing this at a time where Peter Dutton's main message was, if you don't know, don't vote. and that we don't have enough detail. And so actually we went out there and had thousands of conversations with people about what detail do you actually need in order to vote. And basically what came back really strongly was people needed two things. They needed a clear sequence of, first, the country will vote. Australia will head to the polls on referendum day. They will vote for this thing. And then after that, this will be taken back to First Nations to communities to have a really thorough consultation about what this looks like. That this will be, a representative body elected by community, not the people in Canberra, not, the advisory bodies that exist. It will be voted by in community. And I think those two things were really important. And so people really just needed those two things. People felt really comfortable with, okay, yes, we will vote, but then this will be taken back to First Nations people to hear from community of how this works. And there are some incredible examples of how democracy works in communities right now already. And so there are really great examples of what this could look like already that exist. And so people felt really comfortable with, one, we vote, and then two, there's a proper consultation. Next slide. And so these are just some frames to embrace in this. And so we have momentum. These are frames that we've tested really thoroughly around what works for people. Momentum of, this really resonated with base, but also tested really well with persuadables. That a vast majority, millions and millions of people voting yes will create momentum for broader transformative change beyond the referendum. And this is also a social proofing frame. Right now, people feel really uncomfortable about coming out and saying they're voting yes. And this piece of momentum of millions of Australians gives people space to actually come out and say, yes, I'm voting yes. The equity frame. And so this was actually one of our most promising frames that we found. It tested that, Australians really believe and support equity. They believe that no matter, where you are, people should have what they need to thrive, regardless of income, race, gender, geography. And so, the research really found that equity is deeply ingrained, and people believe that people shouldn't be locked out of democracy and decision making. And so this was a really great frame to use. The next frame is around First Nations led solutions. And so obviously, this is about, First Nations people having a say on the issues that impact their own lives. Talking about that in a strength-based way is really credible for people of, this is what this will do to move us to where we need to be. Who we could be as a nation. So this really resonated with the base and persuadables, because people are really motivated by a better future. And messages that paint a picture of, one that celebrates and respects First Nations people and our culture. I think something to note is that First Nations people are looking for, a self-determination and a truth-telling moment, and the rest of the country is really looking for coming together who we could be as a nation moment. And then finally, the last frame is around representation. And so this frame we really tested and went out there and tested around constitutional recognition. We know that symbolic constitutional recognition is going to do nothing for to move us to where we need to be. We also know that symbolic constitutional recognition was rejected by our communities. But actually, when we talk about representation as a frame, is really strong, because it's about First Nations people having a representative body to make decisions and give advice about the issues that impact us. And I think the other thing to say in this is, when we talk about constitutional recognition, we're actually making Australia and the Constitution, which, the majority of the population don't know what's in the Constitution, haven't read it, don't know what it is. And so talking about constitutional recognition puts that at the center of this story versus representation, which puts First Nations people at the center of this story. And that's really crucial. Next slide. And so these are just some examples of frames that we could use, for momentum. This referendum will create momentum for broader transformative change beyond the referendum. And just a note around equity that it's, really held quite strongly by people, and, a frame of, everyone should be treated fairly and equally respected. We should all have a say, especially in decisions that impact us, was like one of the strongest frames that we tested. Yeah, I think we can go. I think it's all good. And I think that's it from me.
All right. Amy, I think it would actually be good to talk about the last frame. Just if we could just mention the examples of that, if we can show that the last slide as well. Like, so these are just like maybe I'll just speak through it. Like, these are just examples of like some words that work, basically, that we can use to frame the conversation or the message on the equity frame. Is like words like, everyone should be treated fairly and equally respected, especially in decisions that impact First Nations communities, for example. Or things like, writing yes in the referendum can help to make our system fairer so that everyone has a chance to be ahead as well. So those are just some examples. So before we go to my next bit, a way for me sometimes to remember the messaging principles that Amy has mentioned, and we'll do this as a quick exercise as well, because we've been sitting down for a bit. How I like to remember the 5 messaging principles, if we can turn off the screen share at the moment, is, and I know you're not on screen, but I trust that you're doing this in your own homes, right? You're doing this with me. So the first one is values. So if we can place it on our heart, so values. Values are the things that, how we build alignment across audiences, because we're able to reach different backgrounds, experiences, and political persuasions, right? So those are our values, like our heart. And then the next is vision. Okay, so if we can do this, vision. So vision is thinking about how this moment is bigger than the referendum, and it's an opportunity to bring about more meaningful change in the long term. So we have values and then vision as a way to remember. And the third one is theory of change. And theory of change is this. I hope it looks like a triangle. It's like a delta, right? Because in mathematics, for the geeks out there, delta is a Greek letter that is used in mathematics to represent change. And also triangles are also one of the strongest geometric shapes, right? So if we repeat that, values in your heart, vision, and theory of change. And then the next one is First Nations strength and leadership. So I'm doing this like Popeye. Because the research shows that persuadables are more supportive of us when they hear messages of strength, optimism, and capability in First Nations communities. Because as Riz has mentioned, ultimately, this vote is about how people perceive First Nations communities. So we need to be, as allies, we need to flood the airwaves in conversations with stories of First Nations strength, leadership, and solutions. So if we go back, so values, vision, theory of change, strength, and leadership. And this one, the last one, the fifth one about sequence, this is actually from Australian Sign Language, sequence. So that means first we vote on the principle of actually having a representative body, and then there's a thorough consultation. Okay, so from the very beginning, I'm just seeing myself, no one else is on stage with me at the moment. So values, vision, transformative change, First Nations strength, and leadership, and sequence. So hopefully that's a way for you to remember those messaging principles, because sometimes, like for me, how I remember things is like I have different hacks of incorporating some movement so that you're able to like remember it as well. So I'm curious to know, because this training is about conversations, and we'll be launching a poll shortly, is how confident folks are with having conversations on the referendum, if we can have a look and launch that poll for folks so we can actually see I guess, the spectrum of experience that folks have. So that's question 3 on messaging. So if we can launch the one that says on the experience spectrum. Great, thank you so much. Yes, so our questions there, if we could ask you to answer, like, how confident are you currently in persuasive conversations? And if you've had experience being a conversee, meaning you're the one that has been persuaded. And if yes, like, what does that feel like? What was the impact? So we'll just wait for folks to share their answers on this question. So I'm really curious to know, what people's level of experience are at the moment. Oh, I see folks are answering now. Great. Okay. So we'll give people a few more seconds to answer, and then we'll see what the results are. Yeah, so this is just a way for us to have like a bit of participant engagement as well. So it's not just us giving input to, and that we're also learning about you or learning from you too. All right, can we close the polls? And great, so there are some folks who are actually so experienced in this and train others already. Some are more like in the middle, and there's a few as well who are totally new to this. So good on you for educating yourself as well, and like trying to learn to how we can better do this. And most people has had the experience of being at the receiving end of a persuasive conversation as well. And if we can highlight some answers about what it felt or what the impact was, if someone can share that in the document so I can see as well, because I am not able to see the results, that would be great. So so folks are seeing like how they feel like they're connected via values, that these kinds of conversations are focused on issues and they're quite purposeful as well. So if we go to our slide now, we can actually see like why are conversations actually powerful. Like they seem like so simple because we do it all the time. Hey, like we converse, but why are persuasive conversations in this instance, like why are they powerful? And it's primarily because conversations are powerful because they don't engage just our head. They also engage the heart. Yeah. And in that space of conversation, that's where we're able to hear people's stories and feel compassion, anger, hope, and we feel listened to and connected to, and we get to trust the other person more as well. And the conversations are really powerful tools, especially in change making, to build connections and share information and give people the opportunity to get involved. Through conversations, we're able to build relationships, encourage action in our local communities, and in turn, we build the power of our movements for First Nations justice. So leading up to polling day, people like you across the country are going to have conversations about the referendum. And it's a chance for us to use the research-based messaging and tools that you learn and will be learning from this training as well. It's important to note that conversations are meant to be organic. So even if we're saying like, this is a structure that you can follow, which we'll do later for the 5 C's conversation structure, every conversation will be different. And what we're trying to do here is we want to give you tools to use to have these effective conversations. And we also have an issue convo guide for you to use or adapt in your own style. But our aim really here is to teach you how to do it. Like, you know, that saying, don't give someone fish, like teach them how to fish. Like as an organizer, that's my intention and purpose as well for you all in this training. And we have a toolbox that you can use, and so that you feel that, you know, whatever situation that comes at you as well, that you're equipped with these tools. And the first one is to make sure that you're grounding conversations in shared values, because like, it's through research, we actually know this, right? Like in different issue campaigns like climate justice, that facts and information actually don't change someone's mind. Yes, facts and information are helpful because they tell us about what it does, but it doesn't tell us why. And the values part, the heart bit, are what guides us ethically, and it shapes what we believe in. So by establishing shared values, we are coming to the conversation through building a common understanding and connection rather than winning a debate. And the second tool is using your personal story. So sharing your personal story means talking about your own experiences in terms that relate to the issue. Maybe talk a bit during your conversation about like your journey into becoming a yes supporter, for example, or the process that you went through to come to that informed decision. Because most people, when it comes to understanding issues like the referendum, most people value the opinions of their friends, family, and colleagues as much as they do the facts and figures from experts, actually. So that's why I think we need to realize here that we actually have a sphere of influence, and you don't need to be a political expert to be persuasive. Like, of course, you know, as I mentioned, facts matter, they give us information, but it's through activating those emotions that we decide what this information means for us. So by including your story, why the referendum matters to you, for example, the kind of Australia you want to see, and by being like relatable, you can build trust with the person you are talking with, and don't overcomplicate things. Just be yourself. Being authentic is what people will remember, actually, and ahead of a long list of statistics, facts, and figures. And by connecting on a human level early on, you are in a far better position to face any challenging parts of the conversation that may arise. And because remember, like people like you, most people are concerned or care about First Nations justice. Your best chance to persuade them to act on their concerns and actually like be a more out yes, be brave enough to actually say that, hey, I'm a yes voter, is through social proofing. I think Riz mentioned that earlier, and there was a question about, hey, is it okay for me like to wear yes shirts, or is that cultural appropriation, or it's that fine? I think you're actually helping with the social proofing by signaling to folks that you are writing yes. And it's also a great way to start a conversation. Hey, if you're wearing a write yes shirt, for example, or if you have any other write yes paraphernalia. And the third one is asking questions, because you're trying to seek to understand. And I really like this statement about being curious, not furious, because what we're trying to do here with conversations is we're trying to build bridges, not walls. And asking questions that get the person thinking deeply about the issue on terms that, or the framing that you set, is one of the most effective ways to get them to change their view. And And it also gives you an opportunity to engage and find out what specific concerns they have as well. And the fourth one is about listening without judgment. So when during that conversation, we listen without interrupting and really listen deeply, like practice deep listening. What values are sitting under the things that this person is saying? Because their answer to the questions that you ask, the prompting questions, will give you clues to how they understand the upcoming referendum and what maybe is holding them back from taking more action. So some examples of good questions, of open-ended questions, can be like, what things are important to you? How do you feel about the referendum? What do you think could make a difference? Those kind of things. Because in order to understand what they can do next, the conversee or the recipient of that conversation, they need to feel heard and empowered to act with confidence. And the fifth one is about the vision piece of the messaging principle. We should help people imagine a different future from what the status quo or what we currently have, and affirm that shared vision as well. And that goes well with the next one, which is we're trying to help people see their place in the solutions, and reinforcing that idea of our individual actions and choice matter, and collectively we can make a greater impact if we do this together, if we work together, and make sure that our government are making better decisions and protecting communities from, for example, like impacts of climate change, like those kind of things, or making sure that they're getting like for cultural heritage protection. So what I'm saying here is that it's our job to help people like connect the dots and see like what their individual act can help or contribute to the solution that we're facing. So hopefully these are like some tools that can help you navigate the conversations that you're having. And in terms of how we can manage pushbacks, we'll go through the next section, and then I'll hand it over to Charlie. But feel free to put in the Q&A function if you have any questions at all.
Awesome. Thanks, Kaz. You can hear me okay? Just thumbs up. Yep. Great. So I'm conscious we've shared a lot with you already, but there are a couple more frameworks that we want to share before Kaz and I dive into some practice conversations. So we want you to have a bunch of tools in your toolbox to help you have the most powerful conversations that you can. And to make this a little easier, we've embedded the tools and the principles that Amy and Riss and Kaz have shared into a bit of a 5-part framework, which we call the 5 C's framework. And it's really designed to kind of help you have conversations which will engage other people where they're at, and to support them to take action that really meets them where they're at in their journey of thinking about the referendum and beyond. So I'll run through that framework briefly now, and then we'll build it into the practice conversation that Kaz and I are going to do in a moment. So just to summarize, the 5 C's are: number 1, connection; number 2, context; number 3, commitment; number 4, catapult; and number 5 is close. So I'm going to talk through each of those points in a little bit more detail. So in the connection piece, and Kaz emphasized that before, we always start with building a connection, building rapport, finding common ground and common values with the other person or people that we're speaking with. If we're meeting them for the first time, we're introducing ourselves here, we're sharing a little bit of our story and why we care about writing yes. And we're also asking them to kind of gauge where they're at on their journey. So, an example of some connection phrases that we could use to share why we care could include something like, I care about this issue because it's an important step towards a society that respects First Nations people and culture and leads to meaningful improvements in the quality of life for Aboriginal people. Or I care because First Nations people deserve to be meaningfully part of decisions which affect their future. So once we've shared a little bit about why we care, then we turn to sort of asking the other person. For example, I'd love to hear if you've heard much about the referendum and where you're sitting on it currently. So once we've built that connection, we can ask people if they're up for having a conversation about writing yes. And then we move into the second part, the context section. So in this section, we want to be really honest about the challenges whilst also building hope and reflecting on the opportunities that this moment presents. We want to be asking lots of questions to draw out where the other person's at, their hopes and their concerns. And so this is the longest section of the conversation because it's where we're going to be going deeper into addressing the other person's concerns. And so because of that, it requires lots of great active listening on our part and compassionate sharing as well. And so for this section, you might find it helpful to refer to the frequently asked questions and common concerns part of the conversation guide, which everyone should have been emailed before today. And that outlines some of those core questions that people are likely to raise if they're sort of sitting in that undecided category. And it's kind of worth having a read over them, familiarizing yourself with them, making them your own and practicing them with a friend until you feel comfortable speaking to them. So to kind of get us into that context section, some phrases we could use to share, why we are devoting time to this issue could include something like, thanks to the hard work of Aboriginal elders and communities, over the coming decade, we could see huge changes in First Nations justice, from treaties to representation to land back, truth-telling and environmental justice measures. And a yes vote will build much needed momentum for these deeper transformative changes. However, a no outcome would set back First Nations justice for decades. And so that's why I'm having conversations with people about writing yes this referendum. And I'm sure you've got lots of great thoughts and questions about it, and I'd really love to hear more about them. And then we get into the back and forth. So that's part 2, the context section. Then when we've addressed everyone's concerns and we've checked in to see that they're feeling clearer about the issue, we can move into asking them to take a commitment, the third part. So we want to move into this gently and not rush to commitment before we spend enough time in context. We're much more likely to get a good commitment if we really spend that time listening and addressing concerns. And in the commitment phase, the more sort of specific that we can be in terms of what we're asking the person to do, the better. So an example of some commitment phrases could include, it sounds like you two feel really strongly about supporting First Nations justice. So I'm wondering, to demonstrate that commitment, would you be willing to pledge to write yes on our website, yes.org.au, and then share this with friends and ask them to do the same? At this point, we might stop there. It might seem like, that's as far as we're going to move someone today, but oftentimes we can actually ask them to do more. And that's why we move into the fourth part, which is the catapult. And so this is where we ask them to take on a concrete job or responsibility beyond just pledging to write yes. And in this part, we might find that people are feeling quite hesitant to commit to having conversations themselves. But wherever possible, we want to be trying to encourage and support them to move into having conversation. As we heard from Kaz and others before, the conversations are the most powerful way of kind of shifting hearts and minds. And the research is showing that those folks in the more undecided category, they're very unlikely to shift their position as a result of just reading material or being exposed to advertising. They need that two-way dialogue. This is a big issue and it requires that kind of two-way compassionate conversation to address their concerns and to really build greater confidence. So some examples of what that catapult could look like include first of all, thanking them for writing yes. That's awesome that you've pledged to write yes. Thank you so much. And then how would you feel about taking just one more action today? Could you, and obviously just choose one of these, but I'm just going to share a few as examples. Could you join our upcoming Write Yes calling party? Could you host a kitchen table conversation with 10 friends? Could you join our next market stall? We'll give you some training and a t-shirt. Could you host a Write Yes morning tea at your work? Or you could also invite them to suggest something that involves conversations. Now, if you're finding that the conversation suggestion just really isn't landing, they really don't want to do that, then and only then could we move to suggesting something like, oh, maybe would you like to distribute some leaflets or to put up a yard sign? We want them to do something rather than nothing. So yeah, if they're not going to take the conversation action, there are some other things that we can suggest. So that's our catapult, the fourth section. And then finally, we move into the close. And this is a part where we summarize the action that they've committed to take and we thank them for their time. And we want to end on a really good and praising note. So an example could look like, thank you so much for speaking with me today and for taking this really important step in standing up for First Nations justice. It's so great that you've pledged to write yes and to host a kitchen table conversation with your friends about doing the same. I really enjoyed talking with you and I'm really looking forward to seeing you as part of the campaign over the coming weeks and months. So that's the 5 C's. We'll just to summarize them from the top. Connection, context, commitment, catapult, and close. You'll see them in action very shortly. Before we go into the fishbowl, as we call it, we just had one last framework, which is designed to focus on when people are raising kind of objections and concerns. So sometimes you might find that your conversations will be really smooth sailing, but often people will raise concerns and objections. And so there's a simple framework that we can use to help with this, which we call the LEAP framework. So LEAP stands for listen, explore, acknowledge, and progress. So again, a little bit on each of those 4 points. So listen. So if someone is raising an objection, we really need to hear the other person and for them to feel heard. And if we listen well, it really communicates respect and it gives people the space to do their own thinking. So some listening skills include actually not speaking, just being nice and quiet, open body language, encouraging comments or noises like, summarizing what they've said to check for understanding and show that you've heard them. And also asking, open questions, which encourage them to share more and to go deeper. So, for example, tell me more, say more. I'd love to hear more about that. So that's a listening piece. Then we want to explore. So sometimes the first thing that people say isn't actually their core concern or objection. So, for example, they might say, "Oh, I'm just too busy," but it actually might mean, I'm not going to prioritize this because I don't think it's going to achieve change. I'm not needed. There's more important things to be doing in my life. So we can ask some sort of gentle questions to find out what's really going on behind what they're saying. For example, I'm really curious, would you be willing to tell me more about that? Or I'd love to know, what happened to lead you to think that? And when we're doing this, it's really important that we're bringing a curious and a compassionate tone. So rather than, why did you say that? I'd love to know more about what led you to say that. So that's our exploratory piece. Then we move to acknowledgement. And so this is where we recognize the reality of the other person's situation and really validate their concern. So, for example, yeah, I totally understand how hard it is to find time with work and with family. And sometimes in this piece, there's some scope to do some troubleshooting with the person or to modify our ask to fit with their circumstances. Sometimes all people really need is just to have some space to name a challenge, to just be really listened to and acknowledged, and then they're actually able to move on. And then the fourth and final point in our objection handling framework is to progress. So here is where we're rephrasing our ask in terms that are relevant to where the other person is at. And, we're reminding them of their own commitment or concern about the issue. So for example, in our conversation, I've been hearing that you feel it's really important for the government to listen and act on First Nations wisdom. And, that means that we need a resounding yes outcome at the upcoming referendum. The way we achieve that is by having powerful conversations with people in our community. And we've got a door knock this Saturday to do just that. So I'm wondering, would you be up for joining us? So those 4 points again: listen, explore, acknowledge, and progress. And I'm going to hand back to Kaz now, and we're going to move into the fishbowl.
Yes. So to get you folks to join us, like in singing from the same song sheet, as so to speak, like in terms of having, really strengths-based, values-based messaging and conversation that share our vision, strength, and credible theory of change. Charlie and I will role play a persuasive conversation. And it's called a fishbowl exercise because it's like we're goldfish in a bowl where you'll observe us doing the role play. And I just wanted to note that traditionally conversations like this take, longer than 10 minutes, but for our purposes, we are just practicing it in a short time. And what I would encourage you to do is to please pay attention to the types of questions that Charlie asks me and the kind of responses that they elicit from me as well. And also, another layer, another ask is like, think of the different like messaging phrases that Charlie uses as well. And maybe you can look back to the principles that was shared by Amy and myself with the mnemonic actions earlier. So yeah, over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Kaz. I'm excited. Okay, so a little bit of further context is that Kaz and I are meeting for the first time at a market stall. And Kaz is currently undecided about the referendum, but she's curious to learn more. So our objective with this conversation really is to support Kaz to move from being undecided to feeling confident about writing yes in the referendum, and ideally to take one further action to help spread the right yes message among her networks. So Kaz, should we do this? Should we get into role?
Yeah, so to get me into the role, I will have my props here so I can channel the conversation that's happening.
Awesome.
All right.
I need some kind of hat, but I don't. Oh, I'll just put an imaginary hat on. All right, great times. Hi there, how are you going today?
Oh, I'm well, thanks. Great weather we're having today, hey.
Oh, it's so beautiful, really wonderful sun. Look, my name's Charlie and I'm a volunteer with the Right Yes campaign. What's your name?
I'm Kaz. Great to meet you, Charlie.
Oh, it's really lovely to meet you too, Kaz. Look, we're here at the markets today to have conversations with folks about the upcoming referendum. I'm curious, Kaz, have you heard much about the referendum?
Yeah, I've definitely seen it like on the news and also my social media feed, but I'm really not that engaged because I have many questions about it, so I just try not to get involved.
Oh, look, you're really not alone in having a lot of questions. We're hearing that from so many people. As I'm wondering, might you be open to having a conversation with me about the referendum today?
Yeah, I actually have some time. This won't take long, right?
No, we'll keep it brief.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I would actually appreciate to get some clarity around this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So, I mean, you mentioned that you have a lot of questions, and I'm wondering, are there any that are forefront of your mind that you'd like to start with?
Yeah. So I'm really confused because I'm hearing different perspectives on this. Like some First Nations camps are yes, some are no. So I don't know who to listen to, and also like I need to see the detail first. Before I make that decision.
Yeah, I'm really hearing you. I just want to check that I've kind of understood those two questions. So I'm hearing you're wondering about, first of all, whether First Nations people agree about the voice. And then second of all, feeling this kind of lack of detail about what it is that we're voting on. Are those the two things?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's start with the first one, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, so on this question of whether First Nations people agree, look, I guess on any big and important issue and in any community, there's always going to be a diversity of views. And all of those views are really valid. And hear it right, yes, we completely agree that we need greater ambition and bigger and longer term transformative change on First Nations issues. And so in that context, creating a representative body is just one step in that direction. However, a resounding yes outcome would send a really strong message that we expect that kind of transformative change for First Nations people. Whereas our analysis, based on many conversations with First Nations leaders and experts and communities, is that a no outcome would set back First Nations justice for decades. Is that kind of making sense?
Yes, I can definitely understand that with any issue that we can expect that there'll be a diversity of views about it. But I'm curious to know, because you mentioned that word transformative change, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. Terms being bandied around quite a lot, hey, and it can sound a bit vague. So, what this entails is a range of things that First Nations people and communities have been calling for decades. So it's things like treaties, like land back, truth-telling, like fully resourced Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, like veto rights on things, including, say, cultural heritage and sacred sites, ending Black deaths in custody and more. And because there's every chance that these things could be delivered in the coming decade, but a no outcome would really hold back momentum for delivering that kind of change, whereas a yes outcome would help to kind of continue to build momentum for those changes to be implemented.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that, Charlie, and that resonates with me as well, like making sure that we have longer term, like First Nations justice. I resonate with that. I go to Invasion Day rallies, for example, because that's something that I also care about. But even if I want to write yes, I'm still not sure because we haven't seen the detail.
Yes, your second question. Let's go there now. So there's a two-step process at play here. So the first one is that we all vote on the principle of whether we should even have a representative body, and that's the referendum. And then First Nations communities, the government, figure out what the model for that looks like. And so the government has committed to lead a thorough consultation process with First Nations communities to develop a truly representative body. But like with all things, we have to demand that they do that, and we have to hold them accountable. And just like with all the changes, the broader systemic changes that I outlined above, it's going to take all of us pushing and standing in solidarity with First Nations communities to ensure that that change is delivered and to ensure that that body is, as strong as it can be.
And what will happen though? Because you mentioned earlier about what yes would mean, but can you now tell me about like what no means actually? What will that look like? What will happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kaz. So I think the reality is that this referendum, it's become about more than a representative body to Parliament. It's actually become more about a vote on how Australia views First Nations communities. And we know that the majority of people realise that this moment is bigger than the referendum. And so in that context, I guess the question that I ask myself about the implications of a no outcome is, what does this say about us as a nation if we vote no to First Nations people having a say about the decisions which impact upon them and their communities? And when I sit with that question, personally, I feel deeply uncomfortable about us voting no. But that's my personal opinion. I'm really curious to hear how's that question sitting for you, and do you think it's the right question?
Yes. So when you frame it like that, like about like saying no as a nation to First Nations having a say about decisions that impact upon them in their communities. It's like that doesn't sit well with me. Like I can feel it in my gut. Like if I ask myself that, I'm like, okay, I'm writing no, like, no, like, like it doesn't sit well with me. But I guess like I'm just an individual. Hey, like why does my vote even matter?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think we actually really underestimate the power that each of us holds. And particularly when we all act collectively, we can create real and lasting change. You know, we've seen it with issues like marriage equality, for example, and with other social justice issues and movements throughout history. And so, you know, it's going to take a majority of us showing up and taking action to ensure that there is truly transformative change delivered on First Nations issues in this country. I mean, that's why I think it matters that each of us writes yes at the referendum. But I actually think that we have to go further than that. We need to do what we can within our communities to spread the right yes message beyond just us as individuals. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Like I'm like now that like hearing you like talk about that, it's like I don't want to be in the no camp. Like I'm not a no person. I don't want to be in the no person if that's what it will mean. So like what do I need to do? Like I'm not very politically engaged or anything, but yeah, so what's my next step?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before we go there, I just wanted to thank you for, you know, being open to hearing what I've had to share today. I'm really appreciating and valuing your time. So in terms of what we can do, look, the first thing we can do, Kaz, is to pledge to write yes at the referendum. And first and foremost, you know, that looks like each of us making a commitment to ourselves, but then it looks like actually pledging publicly. And so the one way you can do that is by heading to our Write Yes website, which is yes.org.au, and pledging there and then sharing that link with your friends and networks. I've actually got a way for you to do that right here and now today. Is that something you'd be up for doing, Kaz?
Yeah, sure. Where
Yeah,
can I see it?
amazing. Yeah, so I've just got this QR code here. If you want to scan your phone, and then it will bring the website up.
All right, thanks. Yep.
That's coming up now.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing.
Yep.
Awesome. Oh, Kaz, well, thank you so much for taking that step and standing up for First Nations justice. I'm really wondering, though, if you might be willing to take a further step today, Kaz. Is that something you'd be up for?
Oh, I'm not too sure because like I'm kind of an introvert, so I'm not sure I'm comfortable like walking up to strangers to talk about these kind of things.
I totally hear you. And I was actually going to ask you about whether you might be up for having some conversations with a few friends or family members. And the reason I was going to ask you that, Kaz, is that we know that conversations are the most powerful way that we can spread this right yes message. And, you know, we know that simply giving people written materials, it's kind of unlikely to provide them with the clarity they need, that folks actually need to be able to talk their questions and concerns through with another person who they trust. And I'm really hearing you. I personally know that having conversations with you people can be a bit daunting. I certainly find it that way. And like you, I'm also a bit of an introvert. But we've actually prepared a really clear conversations guide to support you with having those conversations. And to be honest, Kaz, I never imagined I'd actually be standing here having a conversation like this with you, but the guide and the team have been really helpful. So with that, I'm wondering, is this something that you might be open to, even just having a conversation with, you know, 3 friends or family members?
Yeah, I think I could do that. If it's just like people around me, like I think I would be comfortable in doing that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I really thank you for that, Kaz. So we've actually got a copy of the guide here, and you can download it from our website too if you want to share it with friends and family members. So can I give you a copy of that guide today?
Sure. All right.
Wonderful. Here you go.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thank you, Kaz. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I'm really grateful for your commitment and for your action. And I'm hoping that I'll see you more around the campaign in the weeks to come.
Yeah, good on you, Charlie. Like, I appreciate you actually taking the time to talk me through it as well, and helping me make an informed decision too. So thank you. Hope you have a good day, Charlie.
You too, Kaz. It's been such a pleasure.
All right. And end scene. All right. End scene. Okay, let me remove my props. So we'll do a bit of a debrief of that thing that we did. And we'll close the slides for now. So maybe I'll ask you first, Charlie. And it's weird because I'm also the participant, but for the convo initiator, like, how was that for you? That experience? What did you find challenging, and what did you feel was like useful or successful?
Yeah, it felt really good thanks to the preparation and resources from Right Yes. I think definitely the most challenging part was that context section where we're kind of working through the different concerns and, you know, being able to check that the response that I've shared is actually addressed the concern for you. So I'm curious to hear from you, Kaz. How was it for you?
Yeah, I think for me, like, in the role of someone that, you know, as a stranger, like, I think I felt like, because I really tried the method acting of like, oh no, like, who is this person chatting with me at first? But I think like how you engaged with me, asking my consent as well, like, hey, are you willing to have a chat about this? And then even if I, as in the role, like not knowing much about it, and then but you still asking questions like, oh, what do you think about that? Like, it made me feel like, oh, I actually don't have need to be an expert to be in this. And what worked for me as well was when you repeated back what I said and actually broke it down, because I was asking like questions like, wait, how about this? What about this? But you broke it down to, okay, your concern is this first, and then this is your other concern. So I think that was quite helpful as well. And what we'll do too is to ask you as observers. We'll launch a poll where you can share your answers to some of our questions as well, about what your observations were and those kind of things. So if we can launch that poll, question 6 of our interactive component.
And maybe while people are answering that, I think there's like a couple of things that are coming out in the question. One, obviously, like, you're not going to use every message for every conversation. And so you really need to map who it is you're talking to, map the community, map your family and friends. Think about what message is actually going to resonate for them. Is it the, who we could be as a nation message? Is it going to be, more ambition like message? Like, you really need to know who you're actually talking to. And, that's hard to do when it's, a random person at a market. And so that's really about why it's like a conversation, right? And not a you talking at them like, here's a message, here's a message, here's a message. And I think, that was done really well between Cass and Charlie, of like, it's an actual conversation. What do you think? Like, asking them that where they stand and trying to see, what are some of their questions? Where do they stand? And then from there, trying to use the toolkit that we have around the conversations and the messaging to figure out where that goes. And I think just the other thing I will say on, there's lots of questions around like treaties. And I think, we've done a lot of research on this, and this particularly for the base and persuadables, like, actually there is a lot more appetite for it than you might think. And yeah, like we said in the chat, support actually jumps 10% for this moment and for this referendum when we talk about the bigger picture. And I think it goes back to what our communities have been calling for decades. And this is also a part of what the government has committed to as well. That said, it's not going to work for everyone. And we know that there are opponents in this who don't agree with this. And we know there's a huge scare campaign being run. The cultural heritage legislation in WA, they're using the same arguments that they used with like the native title fights in the 80s and 90s. And so it doesn't work for everyone. And so that's, again, going back to like, how you need to map your community, what message is going to work best for them. Sorry, I just thought I would bring that up while people are putting the chat in, because that was coming up a few times.
That's great, Amy. And just on that first point, I think because this was a truncated conversation, in a longer conversation, we would have spent more time in the connection part, actually me asking Kaz some more questions to elicit some of her values and concerns and things. We kind of moved fairly rapidly into the context piece for the fishbowl example.
Yeah, and also there was a question about, can we just model something that's quick? I think because of the purposes of this training, we wanted to be able to flow to the different structures and also respond to some common concerns using the messaging. So it's more about because it's a training, it's a training exercise more than anything. And usually as well, we as Charlie has mentioned, the conversation initiator would actually tend to ask more questions and try to unpack as well the responses that the conversee, which my role is there at the moment, to just go, I guess, underneath the surface of what they're saying. So yeah, it was just because of our training as well, for our training purposes. And in terms of, someone mentioned that if we can maybe close the poll now, as we gather the results. There was a question about when people get to thinking they might vote yes, they need to be able to sit with that for a while rather than be expected to go further, to have conversations with others. And I think that's totally your call. Yes, we have that structure where it's okay, you've got them to commit. Do you go next to the catapult? I think it really depends on the context as well. If you really feel a strong, that's the further that they can go for now, it's that's totally fine. I don't think you should feel oh, my conversation was a failure because I didn't get to the catapult bit. It's it's really a context to context basis. This is just as an organizer, again, it's we're trying to step people up into leadership, right? It's you have that ladder of engagement, and you met them here, you got them here. It's can we push a bit and see? But it depends on you as the convo initiator. Are they there yet? Or is it, oh no, this feels better. If we should do a close now. And so I think it's it really depends on you to also sense the vibe as well. And there were things that said that what they have observed is so folks have mentioned that it's good to have a toolkit, for example, and there seems to be a very respectful exchange of ideas. Oh, and then someone actually said there that, it's not actually hard to have these kind of conversations. It feels very encouraging and respectful, not pushy, more listening. So kudos on you there, Charlie, and keeping an open mind to the thoughts to the people you talk to and understand their current position. And then lots of checking in. Charlie did that really well, making sure am I hearing you right? Is this my understanding of what you mentioned? Is that correct? And there's still that you're listening, but also that respectful challenging as well. And that validation. I think we undervalue the value of validation. Sometimes in psychology, right? Just the needs, there are certain needs to be met, and we need to feel heard. We need to feel listened to, even if we don't agree, right? In communication. And they were also checking in, not just clarity around what you were thinking, but how do you feel about that? So there's thinking and also feeling as well. And that active listening was very important. And the curiosity that you showed, Charlie, I think that people really saw that as a way to try and build connection, empathizing, acknowledging, paraphrasing provided information to address the concerns. It was quite a gentle approach as well, and very polite and respectful. Are there other things or questions, responses that you find useful that we've asked, and phrases that you mentioned, Charlie, about I hear where you're coming from is blah, and saying things like, yes, I understand, I'm a bit of an introvert myself. I think that also was mentioned here. And that question
that resonates with a lot of people.
yeah,
Totally. And I wasn't lying. I actually am, right? So,
Yeah, me too.
if I can do
Many
it in front of
organisers are.
hundreds of people, we can all do it.
And I think someone mentioned here that it was very powerful for them, the question that you asked about what does it actually mean, like as a nation, like living in a nation where we're saying no to this, right? Like what does this say about Australia?
Yeah, and on that, I think, if we have other forms of personal connection, we can reframe that question. We could have built, again, in the intro part, like any personal story of yours to kind of build more connection in. Again, we kind of move fairly quickly through that bit. So building stories in is really great as well.
I think on that, just like before you go out and have some of these conversations, and we'll talk about resources in a bit, like maybe just sit down and think about like why you're voting yes, right? Like what this moment means to you and what it would mean, for you to vote yes and for the country to vote yes, and really start there. Because I think, you guys touched on it, but that personal connection and that personal reasoning why is really important to connect with people. So maybe just spend some time thinking about exactly why you were voting yes, right? And it's different for everyone.
All right. So I think it would be useful as well for this time. We'll open like to some questions. I know there's been like a backlog of some questions. But yeah, maybe Amy, if you want to do this first round, if you want to pick some of the questions, and then
Give me 1 second to pull the doc up.
Maybe while you're looking through that, just that bit about engaging and showing support, I think it's really important for us to do that social proofing piece. So to make people like feel that, hey, like it's not just me, that a lot of people are actually supporting this as well, like to counter, I guess, the dominant narrative of like the racist no as well, right? Like, and because you're brave enough to show that you're writing yes, and it gives other people that sort of that freedom to say, oh, I can write yes to this too. And so, for example, like for me, how I'm doing that, granted I work for GetUp, but like a simple way to do that is when you're sending your emails, that email signature, you can just have like a little write yes there, just to signal to folks that, hey, I'm a yes voter, like it. There's like simple things that you can actually do to help with that social proofing. But Amy?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few questions in here around like First Nations strength and leadership and people wanting examples. I think there's a couple of things. One, some of the examples we've already given, like around like the COVID example of the fact that, a lot of people don't know that a lot of the Aboriginal controlled, health organizations and legal services were actually set up by mob, and that they were set up so that, they were run in culturally safe ways in communities, with, Aboriginal health practitioners working with mob to get better health outcomes. And we know that actually works. We know that when mob are being looked after by mob in really safe ways, we have better health outcomes. We can look to places in the climate movement, right? Indigenous ranges, backburning in fire seasons. A lot of times it's that backburning is really informed by practices of local mob who know the area, know when we need to be doing backburning to prevent catastrophic fires. And, fire services and First Nations mob all work together around that. And it's really mob leading that kind of thing. We can look to, fights around climate justice, the Torres Strait Islander mob, campaigning for seawalls, and, the traditional owners in the Beetaloo who are standing up against fracking. Like, there are such incredible stories of strength if you just, you know, have a look out there in the work. And then I think the other thing to say is that a lot of this is also in the broader Passing the Message Stick research and report. And we'll make sure that everyone gets that, and we'll talk a little bit about resources, but there are examples of that in that report that people can read up on and have a look. But I think also just looking to your own community of what's happening there, looking at language revitalization. You know, there's a young woman, Vanessa Farrelly, out of Alice Springs, who is leading her community to revitalize language and is doing language classes with young preschooler kids and young primary school kids, making sure that language isn't dying. And so I think, yeah, there's just lots of examples like that all across the country of really incredible stories of cultural revitalization, working with other communities to, you know, stop fires, all those types of things that are happening around.
And I think there's a question here that maybe will be good for you around GetUp's role. So there's a question from Susan here about the official campaign, like Yes 23 already out there, letterboxing, leafletting. How are we as GetUp in the Right Yes campaign working with what's out there as well?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is about supporting the referendum, right? We've all got the same goal. And, you know, GetUp is using our infrastructure and the work that we do in every election, you know, the work we did in the marriage equality campaign, using the tools and our membership available to make sure that everyone is voting yes at this referendum. You know, we will be doing calling parties and all of that. And so it's all a part of the big ecosystem of this work. But I think what's really important to also note is that for us and for GetUp and our commitment to First Nations justice, this doesn't end on referendum day. We will be there the day after, continuing to do this work, because we know this is at the end goal, and, you know, this is just one step. And so I think that's also important to note. A lot of this, yes, this is for the referendum, but this is for whatever happens after referendum as well. And that work is work that GetUp and our members are really strongly committed to.
Right. And then there's a question here as well around if we want to inspire and promote hope or vision around the referendum, is saying what will happen if no wins, is that too negative? I think there was a question here. I'm not sure who asked that, but yes, that's a question for you, Amy.
Yeah, I think this is a hard one and something that we're really grappling with. I think we need to be realistic about where we are and what this means. And I think it's important to talk about what this country will look like if we vote no, and what this means for not just First Nations justice, but what does this mean for climate justice? What does this mean for economic justice in this country? Because we are trying to build a more progressive, a fairer society. And if we lose, you know, politicians of all stripes and all sides are going to be less eager to have big, bold reforms. And so I think it's important to know that. And I think it's important to make sure that that's not necessarily the conversation we're having with the general population on a market stall, but it's the conversation we need to be having about what this looks like as we talk about what happens over the next decade. And I think we need to be, you know, having those conversations, but I think, you know, we also just need to be throwing everything that we have at the next 8 weeks. We have 8 weeks to be having thousands of conversations, to be, you know, holding calling parties, market stalls, all of those things, sharing things on social media, talking to your family and friends. Like, that's what counts right now. And that's what we really need to be looking forward to.
And then there's a question around engaging, like, definitely no voters. So are we recommending trying to engage someone who is definitely a no, or just to leave them?
Yeah, I think this is it really depends on context of, is it someone in your family that you can have an honest and open and respectful conversation with? I think, have those conversations, because it might not necessarily be about them voting yes right now, but it might leave a seed of the next, campaign or the next conversation that you have. And that's really important. That's how we move people in the long term, is having conversations, because we know people really trust people that they know, and listen to the people that they know. And so it's really about looking at that bigger vision. I think if you're at a market stall, or it's somewhere public, and someone is being, abusive and is being, adamant that they are voting no, I think there is, you need to use your best judgment of, actually, I need to move on from this conversation, be respectful, say thank you for your time, and just move on, because we have 8 weeks and that's not a lot of time. And so I think it just really depends on the situation.
And there's also a great question here about from someone who lives in the NT, saying that, the majority of people I ask about the voice referendum tell me they either haven't heard about it or don't understand what it's about. I'm grateful for the guide you've put together. And I wonder, though, if you have any advice on how to approach local First Nations people. I'm not sure if they're First Nations people themselves, the questioner, about publicly supporting the Yes campaign and actively canvassing the community.
Yeah, and I think this is a big part of the work that my team is doing, our First Nations team. We do a lot of work around elections, around democratic participation, and holding space and making sure mob, in places like the NT and North Queensland, in WA, have all of the information, all of the tools, so that they can make informed decisions. We talk a lot about free, prior and informed consent, and that's particularly crucial when it comes to elections and referendums. And so our team has been doing a lot of work over the last, 8 months now, holding space for mob in communities all across the country to talk about this in a space that is about mob, that gives them information of where this is at, because you're right, lots of people don't know about this or are really unsure. And so that's a really big piece of the work that we're trying to do. And I know there's, other organizations that are doing it, First Nations Workers Alliance, the First Nations Union are doing a lot of work around this as well. And so we're really trying to do a bunch of that to make sure mob know, because, come referendum day, if mob in communities, in remote communities aren't voting, that sends a signal around this. And so we need to make sure that we really do that work. And so that's a big part of the strategy of Get Up.
And speaking of strategy as well, there's a question here around, why do we say write yes in the campaign rather than vote yes?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One, when you go to vote on referendum day, you actually have to write yes or no. It's not a tick box of like an election. And what we've found is people don't know that. And so what we're trying to do is socialize the fact that when people go in on referendum day, they have to write yes or no, because we don't want to have an extra barrier for people when they go in and vote. And, even we're finding media is still saying, tick a box. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there. We haven't had a referendum in a really long time. And so people don't know what the vote will look like. And so we're trying to do a kind of civics education piece there. And then I think the other piece is Australians don't like being told how to vote. And so we found that if we say vote yes, people are getting really, particularly persuadables, are really like, don't tell me how to vote, don't want to hear it. But actually we tested write yes quite a lot, and that's a softer way for us to get into the conversation, and people felt safer around write yes rather than vote yes. And so that's really, really why we're trying to socialize that piece of work.
And then there's a comment here from someone saying, like, I was shocked to hear people who I thought of as intelligent mimicking the no campaign rhetoric about we don't know what we're voting for. I felt they were expressing fear. Is there a sentence or question we can use to allay fear of change or the unknown? I think, if I may, like Amy, like I just wanted to share, like when a few days ago when we had this community event in Brisbane, this was actually mentioned by one of the participants there, that he said what that he uses is like, if you're undecided or if you don't know, learn more, or like educate yourself. And I thought like, yeah, I think that's like learn more. It's like, how can we, so it's also a bit about like putting it on to folks as well. Like, how can you actually learn more about this? Maybe it's asking a question about like, oh, I'm hearing that you want to know, are there, what resources, what networks are you part of? What, you know, like where you can also like learn more. So it's also that sense of a bit of a personal responsibility as well. Where, yeah, and Amy, go ahead.
No, you go, you keep going.
Yeah. So I just thought that was pretty cute, quite cute. From this elderly gentleman, like saying that as a way, like just to encourage the other person, like to learn more about it, or asking the questions that ignite that curiosity as well. But Amy,
I think the other thing, right, is if there is fear, we know from history that when First Nations people have, you know, better health policies, like are calling for better health policies and better health outcomes, and, you know, education outcomes, actually it doesn't just help First Nations communities, it helps the whole country, because the whole country is talking about how we can have better healthcare systems, how we can have a better education system, you know, how we can, you know, look at extractive fossil fuel projects and what that means for climate change. If we're talking about these things as a nation, it really helps First Nations communities, but it helps the whole country. And so, you know, we actually get better outcomes when we all work together, right? And so I think that that's really key, in that fear of like, actually better policies is better for the whole country.
all right, let's see if there are other questions here as well. Okay. There's one thing, because we mentioned that that this isn't the final destination, right? The referendum isn't the final destination. It's just a step in the right direction. So their question is like, once the date is announced, will there be a communications campaign to help us with our conversations? Like what goes hand in hand with those in-person conversations as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are doing the work to ramp up all of that. There will be resources available. This kind of goes into the closing bit, but we will have, you know, events for calling parties, and we will be out on referendum day handing out how to like vote yes cards. We have, you know, our volunteers all across the country who are planning events. You know, our Brisbane group is planning markets every Wednesday, and they are planning to do letterboxing. And so there are already groups all around the country that you can be plugging into, and we will make sure that we send all of those resources. I think we're sending, you know, a conversation guide out after this. We're sending a postcard as well that you can actually write like why you're voting yes, and be sharing it with your neighbours, because again, you know, it's great for people to be hearing from campaign heads and on the media and getting the official pamphlet, but actually hearing from their neighbours about why they're voting yes and socialising that is really important. So we'll be sending around that. And then we'll also be sending around all of the passing the message stick resources, that you've got all of, you know, what we've talked about today in front of you, so you can sit down and digest. And I think someone had a question about like, if I have questions after and I can digest the information, like where can I go? And we will definitely have a support email address for people to be writing emails, and we will be answering all of those questions and supporting you, particularly over the next 8 weeks.
All right, so I think this is a good time now to launch our second to the last interactive component in our webinar. So we'll be launching it's question 8 around the debrief of like what you've seen as well, like in the Fishbowl, and it's questions around whether you've had any, you know, aha moments or insights from when we did the modeling or the role play practice, and were there things that you know were quite challenging for you as well, and so having seen the demo, for example, like what would you like to pick out from what you've seen from Charlie do that you think you'd like to try out or differently next time, if you're already having conversations in your community? So we'll keep this up a bit, and we'll let you know as well when we're trying to when we're gonna be closing it, to give you a bit of a heads up, or hearing from feedback from folks that they need a bit more time. So maybe while folks are doing this, we can go to the next bit around the next steps of what people can do and what's upcoming as well. If we can go to the slide on the resources that we'll be having in the website. So, because people were mentioning about like what resources are available on the site. So we have the conversation guide as well. And to help with the letterboxing or postcarding, we have this little postcard template as well that you can print out and then write and then send to your neighbors as well. And next is some people have mentioned that they're curious about where the research is from, like where are we basing this conversation training on when we talk about strengths-based messaging, that's purposeful, that's values-based. It's actually coming off the back of what is called the passing the message stick. And maybe Amy, if you can quickly talk about what passing the message stick is for people who might be hearing about it for the first time.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this at the start, but passing the message stick is a much bigger research project than just the referendum. And so the passing the message stick is a multi-year project. We first started, I think, in 2019, that basically looks at persuasive messages around First Nations justice and transformative change on First Nations justice issues. And it is a multi-org research project, and it sits across Australian Progress, Get Up, and then Auntie Jackie Huggins. And so it looks, and it's a very different style of message testing as well. And so it looks at messages that need to work for all three of First Nations communities, the base of people who are active, and then persuadables. And it really looks at how those messages can move people to action. And we do things like, dial testing, and we do focus groups, and we go out there and talk to the community about what works, and we do interviews, and we've analysed the way that the media and politics speaks about First Nations people, and how mobs speak about First Nations people, and how those two things don't align. Media politics speak in deficit, mobs speak in a real strength-based way. And so we look at how we can use those messages to create change. And so all of this that we've based this on is grounded in that research that's been going since 2019. And so it's really thoroughly researched and tested and actually works. And we've been rolling out these trainings all across the country with Australian Progress. We've been to Adelaide, Cairns, Alice Springs, Brisbane, Sydney, all across the place rolling this out. And what we're hearing overwhelmingly from people is this is the message that we need to be talking about in this moment. And going back to what Annie Joyce said, if she had known in the last referendum that they were going to win, she would have asked for so much more. And so we're trying to talk about what is at stake here and what's on the table. And this message is tested, and it's working on the referendum. We're moving people on this. And so, that is the passing the message stick plug.
Yeah. And you were speaking of events as well. So while we're at it, while we're plugging, we actually have, so I'm in Perth at the moment, and we have Right Yes community event happening tomorrow in the WA State Library in the Great Southern Room as well. So if that's something that, if you're here in Perth and want to come, that's at 12 to 2 p.m. Western time. And in terms of other upcoming events, we do have the Right Yes Welcome Call happening in August 24. Please don't worry if you missed that one, because we're going to have another one in September. So it's a monthly thing at the moment, but like closer to the date when that is announced, it will become fortnightly. So it's just a way for new people, new pledgees or folks who come on board to the campaign, like to understand our plan to win, our why, and also get to know just the community as well that we have. Hey, so for those kind of calls, we'll have Larissa there as well. You'll see Amy there too, and myself. And we're also kicking off every Wednesdays. We call them Right Yes Wednesdays. We'll be kicking off with calling parties. And calling parties are basically, it's where using our tool, we're able to reach and call folks as well and have these kinds of persuasive conversations. And maybe for now, maybe we can have a look at because the polls have closed, whether we can lift up some of the insights folks have shared and what they found challenging as well. All right. So I think for some folks, it was very useful to see how you can have such a conversation that's not in a like a debate way, and it's something you can actually do it in a friendly way. And they appreciated the inclusive conversation ideas about listening and getting into discussion rather than confrontation. And that conversations are actually about values. I think if there's anything that you can get away from this, like, it's not statistics. Like, unfortunately, facts and figures don't actually change people's minds. If that was the case, we won't have to be in the position we're in with climate justice as well, right? And campaigning for climate justice, the facts are already there, but it's really about the political will. And how do we get to that political will and move people into action? It's by evoking emotions that will motivate them to actually act. And thanks for the shout out as well. They're saying the passion and wisdom of each of you this morning, and that they hope that we continue to have these kinds of sessions that are informative, affirming, yet challenging as well. And just the invitation, I think, Charlie, someone who made a shout out here, that piece when you said, I'm wondering if you're open to having a conversation with me about the referendum. So it was more of like an invitation as well, and like ask someone's consent. And it felt like a relational interaction as well. And also thinking about their own personal story and their own reasons for saying yes, and then practicing that. And that they felt the conversation tips were great, and it was good to have it demoed, and the interaction was quite respectful and non-threatening, and will also help me with climate conversation. So I think that's a really good note, is that although this is part of the convo training for the referendum, the frameworks, like the 5 C's, conversation 5 C's, the LEAP, of objection handling, you can actually apply these to other issues as well. And just like, recognizing as well what people have mentioned about what could be challenging, just that start of opening that conversation as well, responding appropriately to the person and being game to draw them out, and stepping through the stages responsibly and constructively. And how the context often shifts around with lots of questions, not jumping in, but staying with explore as well. And yeah, like just saying that, hey, our interaction was quite respectful, acknowledging as well that for some conversations, it might involve interruptions and diversions, requiring a considerable skill to stay on topic and message, where you can do that acknowledge piece, but still pivot as well to make sure that you're progressing the conversation. And yeah, just a shout out as well to someone saying that they're also a fellow introvert here. and seeing how they can challenge themselves to step out there. And also just noting that tip of holding that judgment back. It's incredibly hard. Like it is true. And yeah, it's like lots to remember. I know we've like we've front loaded a lot of like principles, tools, frameworks for you here. Like I acknowledge that. But we really wanted, we made that decision to do this because we want you to, like, after this training, that you feel confident to actually go out there and you feel like you are equipped with the tools, the knowledge, to actually start practicing as well. So that's why one of the reasons why we've front loaded it here. But you are able to do more of a deep dive when you read the conversation guide. Because I imagine that for some folks like me, like I need to visually see and read it first for me to absorb and feel confident to actually try it out. And yeah, someone saying that they'd actually try. They want to try and challenge themselves to take the information here. And yeah, thanks for, I think it's Anne. Thanks for validating that. Yes, that there might be much information to take in, but it's enough information to begin your journey. So I think that's really what we're trying to do here as well. So before we close, this is our last interactive section now, and we'll go to our closing. It's just a simple question of head, heart, hands. Okay, like out of all the things that we've discussed, maybe is just one. We'll put it in the poll if someone can launch it. Is just one thing you've learned, and then in your heart, something you liked or appreciated about our training today. And third is something you'll do or try after the training. So it's hands, about action. So it's head, heart, and hands. If someone could launch the poll, so folks can do that as we end. And we'll slowly draw to a close and wind it up. So from the bottom of our hearts here with Get Up, the Right Yes campaign team, our movement partners, we'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your Sunday to join us today and educate yourself and taking that step. Yeah. Because like it's a Saturday. Sorry, I'm getting my days mixed up. It's a Saturday for taking the time to actually do this so you're better equipped. So we appreciate all of you, and for also the feedback that you give us. It's important that we try to refine and make our trainings like better and better as well. So we'll include in chat where you can provide a more structured way or like an evaluation form. And so we can hear from you. We'll put that in chat as well. Yeah.
And I think just before everyone like jumps off, I think like these these types of trainings don't just happen, and a lot of work kind of goes into them. We have had hundreds and hundreds of people on this call. We've had hundreds of questions and lots of interaction, and so we are really lucky to have helped by a bunch of movement partners. If everyone who has been helping can jump off on your video. We've had people from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, from Tipping Point, from Australian Progress. There has been, a bunch of other people who have jumped on board to help and given up their Saturday for this. And I think, that's what this moment is about. Like, this moment is about the momentum we need to build over the next 8 weeks. And that's not going to happen with just mob alone. Like, we need everyone on board. And so I just really appreciate you all for giving up your Saturdays to help us answer all the questions. all of the tech issues. So yeah, just really want to thank everyone for jumping on board. I really appreciate it. But I think, you know, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take all of us having thousands of conversations, you know, posting on social media, doing the work over the next 8 weeks to win this. And it's not going to be easy, but actually the momentum we build is going to be really critical for the next decade on First Nations justice, on climate justice, on economic justice, and all the things that we all work on. So just really appreciate everyone and everyone for coming on this call. And then, yeah, I'll throw back to Kaz to answer the closing poll, and then we're done.
All right, so we'll close the poll shortly. Yeah, so Amy mentioned about like it's going to be like a challenging time, especially like in the as things ramp up. So I'd actually like to invite you to that first question. One of the first questions that we asked, it's like, who or what gives you strength or inspires you as we ramp up this campaign? And I'd like you to think of that person or what you mentioned. So, and remember that, like hold that in your head, like right now, so that in those difficult times when you probably haven't slept much, or like you've talked to so many people and you're exhausted, it's like that, remember that person or what you mentioned to help and revive and renew you and fill your cup again as well. So thank you so much, folks. We really appreciate like each and every one of you taking the time today, and we'll see you in the streets and also like in the different events that we're having. And yeah, any last right, so we have, yeah, I think this is just a closed captioning broadcast, but yeah, so thank you so much, folks, especially for the things that you've put the feedback and the engagement piece as well. So with that, are we okay to close, Amy? You reckon? Great. All right.
Have a great Saturday,
folks.
everyone.
Yeah. Have a great rest of the
Bye.
weekend. Bye. Yep. So folks are slowly leaving. We'll just stay on the call to see if there's some stragglers. Great. And that's it. Awesome. Thanks, team. We can end the call. Great.